Welcome, somewhere past the last road, where the sand runs all the way to the sky, there is a hermit who has lived among the dunes longer than anyone can say. Tonight he is sitting by a small fire, low and steady, and there is room enough beside it for you. You do not need to bring anything with you. Not your worries, not your plans, not even your name. Just come and sit. Before we begin, feel free to notice the weight of your body settling into wherever you are lying. Notice the air on your skin. That is enough to start. Thank you for joining us here at the fire. Let us begin. The hermit says that many years ago, early in his time living among these dunes, he learned to read the sky the way other people read faces. A certain color at dusk meant wind by morning. A certain stillness in the air meant heat that would not break for days. But there was one particular evening, early in his desert years, when the sky looked exactly like it did before the worst storm he had ever seen, the one that had once buried half a trade route in sand and nearly cost him his life. The clouds gathered the same way. The wind shifted the same way. Every sign pointed to the same conclusion. He spent that whole night awake, reinforcing his shelter, moving his supplies to higher ground, bracing himself again and again for what he was certain was coming. Morning arrived instead. Ordinary, quiet, unremarkable morning. The clouds had drifted apart some time before dawn without him noticing. No storm had come. Only a long, exhausting night spent preparing for one. The hermit says he learned two things that night, though it took him years to fully understand the second one. The first was practical. Signs are not guarantees. The second was harder to accept. The exhaustion of that night did not come from a storm at all. It came entirely from his own bracing, hour after hour, against something that, in the end, was never there. He says this is worth remembering the next time your mind gathers clouds of its own, certain that something terrible is about to arrive. Sometimes it does arrive, and preparation was wise. But often, by morning, you find the sky was clear the whole time, and only you were storming. Notice, if you can, whether tonight you are bracing for a storm that is actually already here, or one that has not arrived and may never come. There is an old story the hermit tells of a watchman who guarded a remote trading post at the edge of hostile territory, decades before the roads were safe. Raiders had struck neighboring posts before, and the watchman took his duties seriously, perhaps too seriously. Every night he stood at his post, scanning the horizon for the smallest sign of movement, certain that the raiders were always one night away. Every distant shape, every drifting shadow, every strange sound became evidence in his mind of an attack that was surely coming. Years passed this way. He barely slept. He grew thin and hollow-eyed, jumping at shadows, certain each night would be the night. His fellow guards began to notice that his constant alarm was wearing down the whole post, more than any actual raid ever had. One evening, an old trader passing through noticed his condition and asked him directly, "How many times has the attack you fear actually come?" The watchman thought about it for a long moment and admitted, "Not once. Not in all these years." The trader said, "Then it seems to me you have successfully defended this post against an attack that has never arrived, at the cost of the only thing that could have actually helped you defend it, a rested and clear mind." The watchman did not stop keeping watch after that conversation, but he changed how he kept it. He learned to watch calmly, alert but not braced, present but not exhausted by his own vigilance. He noticed, in time, that he saw the horizon just as clearly this way, perhaps more clearly, since his eyes were no longer straining against his own fear. The hermit says most of us keep a kind of watch like this in our own minds, scanning constantly for the disaster we are sure is coming. The watching itself is not the problem. The bracing is. Let your watch tonight, whatever you are watching for, be calm rather than braced. There is an old story the hermit tells of a watchman who guarded a remote trading post at the edge of hostile territory, decades before the roads were safe. Raiders had struck neighboring posts before, and the watchman took his duties seriously, perhaps too seriously. Every night he stood at his post, scanning the horizon for the smallest sign of movement, certain that the raiders were always one night away. Every distant shape, every drifting shadow, every strange sound became evidence in his mind of an attack that was surely coming. Years passed this way. He barely slept. He grew thin and hollow-eyed, jumping at shadows, certain each night would be the night. His fellow guards began to notice that his constant alarm was wearing down the whole post, more than any actual raid ever had. One evening, an old trader passing through noticed his condition and asked him directly, "How many times has the attack you fear actually come?" The watchman thought about it for a long moment and admitted, "Not once. Not in all these years." The trader said, "Then it seems to me you have successfully defended this post against an attack that has never arrived, at the cost of the only thing that could have actually helped you defend it, a rested and clear mind." The watchman did not stop keeping watch after that conversation, but he changed how he kept it. He learned to watch calmly, alert but not braced, present but not exhausted by his own vigilance. He noticed, in time, that he saw the horizon just as clearly this way, perhaps more clearly, since his eyes were no longer straining against his own fear. The hermit says most of us keep a kind of watch like this in our own minds, scanning constantly for the disaster we are sure is coming. The watching itself is not the problem. The bracing is. Let your watch tonight, whatever you are watching for, be calm rather than braced. Two merchants once prepared for the same difficult crossing through a stretch of desert known for sudden weather and occasional bandits. The first merchant packed for every disaster he could imagine: extra water in case of drought, weapons in case of bandits, medicine in case of illness, spare parts in case of breakdown. His cart grew so heavy with preparations for disasters that had not happened that his animals struggled from the very first mile, worn down before the real journey had even properly begun. The second merchant prepared reasonably, enough water for the distance with a sensible margin, a few basic tools, a plan for what to do if trouble arose, without trying to carry a solution to every disaster in advance. Halfway through the crossing, a sudden sandstorm did arise. Exactly the kind of trouble both merchants had feared. The first merchant, exhausted from days of hauling excess weight, struggled badly, his animals too worn down to move quickly to shelter. The second merchant, rested and traveling light, reached safety well before the worst of the storm hit. Afterward, the first merchant asked the second how he had managed to prepare so well with so much less. The second merchant said, "I did not try to carry a solution to every disaster I could imagine. I prepared reasonably for the journey in front of me and trusted myself to handle what actually arrived, rather than what I feared might." The hermit says there is a difference between reasonable preparation and trying to carry armor against every imagined disaster. The second kind of preparation, however well-intentioned, often leaves us too exhausted to handle the one real difficulty when it finally comes. You do not have to carry a solution to every disaster you can imagine tonight, only enough for what is actually in front of you. A young camel, still new to desert travel, once spotted a long, dark shape stretched across the sand ahead and refused to move, certain it was a snake. The caravan waited patiently while the handlers tried to coax the camel forward, but no amount of gentle encouragement would move it. The camel's whole body stayed rigid with fear, eyes fixed on the dark shape, utterly convinced of the danger. An older camel, who had made this same crossing many times, walked forward without hesitation and stepped directly onto the shape. It was, of course, only the long evening shadow of a nearby rock formation, harmless and motionless, exactly as it had been all afternoon. The young camel, seeing the older one walk through the danger without consequence, finally relaxed enough to continue, though the handlers noted it remained jumpy at shadows for much of that first journey, unable yet to distinguish a real threat from an imagined one. The hermit says this is not a flaw unique to young camels. Most of us, especially early in facing any new fear, cannot yet tell the difference between an actual danger and merely the shadow of one. It takes experience, and often someone else's steady example, to learn that not every dark shape stretched across our path is something that can actually hurt us. With time, the young camel would learn to look more closely before reacting. This is available to us too, not never noticing the dark shape, but learning to look closely enough to tell a shadow from a snake before spending all our fear on it. Whatever dark shape has caught your attention tonight, look at it closely for a moment. It may be only a shadow. A fisherman who lived near a small desert oasis spent one entire season certain that the drought everyone spoke of, the one that came every so many years and dried the pool down to nothing, was about to arrive that very year. He spent his days watching the water level obsessively, measuring it against marks he had made on a nearby stone, convinced each slight drop meant the drought had finally come. He caught fewer fish that season than any year before, not because the fish were scarce, but because he spent so much time worrying about the water instead of actually fishing in it. The drought did not come that year. The pool, as it turned out, was simply going through its normal seasonal drop, the same small fluctuation it experienced every year at that time. Nothing unusual at all. The following year, an old fisherman who had lived by the pool for decades noticed the young fisherman anxiously measuring the water again and said, "The pool has done this every year of my life. Sometimes I've thought it looked like the beginning of something worse, and every time it was only the ordinary rhythm of the season. You could spend your whole life watching for the drought and miss every good fishing day in between." The hermit says ordinary fluctuation, the normal rise and fall of any life, is often mistaken for the beginning of disaster. And in watching so closely for the disaster, we frequently miss the good, ordinary days happening right in front of us in the meantime. Whatever fluctuation you have been anxiously watching lately, consider that it may simply be the ordinary rhythm of a season, not the beginning of what you fear. A young trader once had a disagreement with a rival merchant over a shared trade route, and though nothing had actually been resolved between them, he spent the following weeks constantly rehearsing arguments in his mind for their next encounter. Walking, eating, even lying awake at night, he ran through imagined conversations again and again, preparing sharp responses to things the rival had not yet said, defending himself against accusations that existed only in his own anticipation. When the two men finally crossed paths again weeks later, the rival greeted him warmly, having apparently forgotten much of the disagreement entirely, or at least no longer caring about it. The confrontation the young trader had rehearsed so many times never happened at all. He returned home that evening feeling strangely exhausted, and it took him some time to realize why. He had, in effect, fought an entire argument, several times over, against an opponent who was not even present, over words that had never been spoken. The hermit says the mind is remarkably willing to fight battles that do not exist yet, and sometimes never will, spending real exhaustion on entirely imagined encounters. The rehearsal feels like preparation, but it is often only suffering in advance for a scene that may never be performed. This does not mean you should never think ahead, but there is a difference between briefly considering how a conversation might go and living through it in exhausting detail dozens of times before it ever happens or fails to happen at all. Whatever conversation you have been rehearsing in your mind, let it rest until it is actually needed, if it is needed at all. A farmer near the desert's edge once heard that locusts had struck a neighboring region 2 seasons prior, and from that point on, he became consumed with the fear that they would strike his own fields next. He spent an entire planting season constantly checking the sky, imagining swarms in every distant cloud of dust, losing sleep over a threat that had not, in fact, come anywhere near his own land. His worry was so consuming that he planted late, tended his crop poorly, distracted by a disaster that existed only in the neighboring region's past and his own imagined future. The locusts never came to his fields that year, or the year after, but his harvest that season was poor regardless, not because of any swarm, but because his fear of one had kept him from properly tending the crop that was actually growing in front of him. An old farmer, hearing about this the following year, told him, "You cannot farm both your actual field and your imagined disasters at the same time. One of them will always suffer from the divided attention, and it is usually the real one, since the imagined one does not actually need tending at all." The hermit says fear of a disaster that struck somewhere else, sometime else, can consume attention that the actual present task badly needs. The neighboring region's locusts were real, but borrowing their disaster into his own imagined future cost the farmer a harvest that had nothing to do with locusts at all. Whatever disaster you have borrowed from somewhere else and carried into your own imagined future, let it return to where it actually belongs, so your attention can return to what is actually growing in front of you. A young sentry stationed at a remote outpost once heard distant thunder rolling across the horizon on a still, hot evening, and became instantly convinced it was the sound of an approaching army's drums. He raised the alarm, and the entire outpost scrambled into defensive positions, weapons ready, hearts pounding, bracing through a long and sleepless night for an attack they were certain was imminent. By morning, no army had appeared. An older soldier, more experienced with the sounds of this particular stretch of desert, explained gently that the distant thunder had likely come from a storm system many miles away, common at that time of year, entirely unrelated to any army at all. The young sentry felt foolish, but the older soldier told him, "Do not be too hard on yourself. It is not wrong to notice the sound and consider what it might mean. What matters is learning over time to tell the difference between a sound that requires alarm and one that only resembles it." He added, "Every sentry raises a false alarm at least once, usually many times, before learning this difference. It is part of how the ear learns what is actually dangerous and what only sounds like danger from a distance. The hermit says most of us, hearing distant thunder of one kind or another in our own lives, will mistake it for an approaching army more than once before we learn to listen more carefully. This is not a failure. It is simply part of learning to tell real danger from its many distant, unrelated echoes. Whatever distant thunder you have heard recently, listen a little more carefully before deciding what it means." The hermit does not often speak of his life before the dunes, but he has admitted, to those who stayed with him long enough, that he did not always live as calmly as he does now. In his younger years, before he found his way to this stretch of desert, he says he spent most of his waking hours bracing for disasters that, looking back, almost never actually arrived. A conversation might go badly. A plan might fail. A relationship might end. He rehearsed these outcomes so often and so vividly that by the time anything actually happened, good or bad, he was already exhausted from having lived through it many times over in his own mind first. He says the turning point came slowly, not from any single dramatic event, but from simply noticing, again and again, how rarely the disasters he braced for actually matched what eventually happened. Some things did go wrong eventually, but almost never in the way or at the time he had imagined. And the bracing itself, he came to see, had cost him far more than any of the actual difficulties ever did. He does not claim to have solved this entirely, even now. He says some nights, even here by this quiet fire, An old habit of bracing for some imagined trouble still rises up in him, but he has learned to notice it more quickly now, and to ask himself gently, is this storm actually here, or am I only imagining its arrival? The hermit says he tells travelers this not to claim he has mastered anything, but so they know this is not a flaw unique to them. Even someone who has sat by this fire for longer than he can count still catches himself bracing now and then for storms that were never actually there. If an old habit of bracing rises in you tonight, you do not have to defeat it completely, just notice it gently the way the hermit has learned to. An old woman in a village near the dunes once admitted, near the end of her long life, that she had spent most of her years bracing for a serious illness that she was certain, at various points, was about to take hold of her. As a young woman, she worried constantly about diseases she had heard of striking others. In middle age, she worried about every ache and pain as the beginning of something terrible. Even in her later years, healthy and strong for her age, she continued to brace herself each season for the illness she felt certain was finally, surely, about to arrive. It never did. Not in any serious way, across her whole long life. She lived to a great age, largely healthy, and only in her final months did a gentle decline take her peacefully. Nothing at all like the dramatic illnesses she had spent decades bracing against. Near the end, she told a young relative who had come to sit with her, "I spent so many good years afraid of a storm that, in the end, never actually came the way I feared it would. I wish someone had told me, when I was young, that the bracing itself was costing me more than the illness ever did." The hermit says this story is not meant to suggest that illness never comes, or that caution is unwise. It is only meant as an honest look at what a lifetime of bracing for a particular disaster can cost, especially when that disaster, in the end, arrives in an entirely different form than we ever expected, if it arrives at all. You do not know exactly what will come in your own life. But the old woman's story suggests it is worth asking, gently, whether the specific storm you have been bracing for years is the one that will actually need your attention when the time comes. Let your years, however many remain, be a little less spent on bracing, and a little more spent simply living them. The hermit says that in the desert, clouds sometimes gather with all the appearance of a serious storm, dark and heavy along the horizon, only to drift apart by evening without a single drop of rain falling. Travelers new to this land often panic at the sight of these gathering clouds, certain a storm is imminent, and rush to make camp early, canceling plans, altering their whole day around a storm that, more often than not, simply dissolves into nothing by nightfall. The hermit does not tell people to ignore gathering clouds entirely. Sometimes they do bring real weather, and preparation matters. But he has learned, over many years, to watch the clouds without immediately assuming the worst. To notice them, prepare reasonably, and then continue with his day, rather than surrendering the whole of it to a storm that has not yet arrived and may never come. He says the sky itself demonstrates this lesson better than any story could. Look up on almost any evening in this desert, and you will likely see clouds gathering somewhere on the horizon. Most evenings, they simply pass. Occasionally, they do bring rain. The sky does not know in advance which evenings will be which, and neither, really, do we. What we can control is how much of our present day we surrender to clouds that have not yet decided what they will become. Notice any clouds gathering on your own horizon tonight, without yet deciding what they will become. Two travelers once approached an old rope bridge stretched across a deep ravine, the only crossing for many miles in either direction. The first traveler stood at the edge for a long while, imagining every way the bridge might fail, every rope that might be worn thin, every plank that might give way beneath his weight. He worked himself into such a state of dread that his legs shook before he had even taken a single step onto the bridge. The second traveler examined the bridge briefly, checked a few of the nearest ropes with his hand, and finding them sound, began to cross steadily, testing each new section as he reached it, rather than trying to guarantee the whole crossing in advance from where he stood. Both travelers made it across safely, but the first arrived trembling and exhausted, having endured, in his own mind, dozens of imagined falls before ever taking a step. The second arrived calm and alert, having dealt only with the actual bridge beneath his actual feet, one section at a time. The hermit says most difficult crossings in life work this way. We can examine reasonably, take sensible precautions, and then meet each section as we actually reach it. Or we can try to guarantee, from a distance, that every possible failure across the whole crossing will not happen, exhausting ourselves before we have even taken the first real step. The bridge itself does not care which traveler crosses it more calmly, but the traveler's experience of the crossing and the reserves they have left once they reach the other side differ enormously. Whatever crossing lies ahead of you, meet it one section at a time, rather than trying to guarantee the whole distance from where you stand now. The hermit says that over many years, he has settled on a single simple question he asks himself whenever he notices his mind bracing hard for some future trouble. The question is this: is this happening now? Or am I only imagining that it will? He says the answer, more often than he would like to admit, even now, is usually the second one. The fire in front of him is real. The cold at his back is real. The storm 3 days from now. The argument that has not happened. The illness that has not arrived. These are not happening now. Whatever his mind insists. This single question does not eliminate the bracing entirely. He still feels it rise up. The old familiar tightness. The urge to prepare for every possible disaster all at once. But the question interrupts it, just enough to let him notice the difference between what is actually here and what his mind has only imagined into the room. He offers this same question to anyone who sits with him long enough to hear it, not as a cure, but as a small, repeatable tool. Is this happening now? Or am I only imagining that it will? Asked honestly, night after night, it slowly loosens the grip of storms that were never actually there. You do not need to resolve every anxious thought tonight. You only need to ask gently of whatever is troubling you right now, whether it is actually here or only imagined. Ask it now quietly of whatever has been troubling you tonight. There is one thing the hermit says more than anything else, so often that travelers who stay with him for even a few nights, find themselves saying it back to him before they leave. The desert does not hurry, and so nothing in it is ever late. The dunes do not rush to become mountains. The stars do not hurry across the sky. Even storms, when they do come, arrive exactly when they arrive. No sooner for all our bracing, no later for all our calm. You are allowed the same pace tonight. You do not need to prepare, right now, for every storm your mind can imagine. You do not need to guarantee the whole crossing before you have taken a single step. The night does not require it of you, any more than the desert requires the dunes to hurry into mountains. Let your breathing slow to match the fire, low and steady. Let your body sink into the sand beneath you, still holding a little of the day's warmth, cooling now under a sky scattered with more stars than anyone could count. Whatever storm you have been bracing for, real or imagined, it does not need you awake and tense to arrive on its own time. The hermit will keep the fire through the night. You do not need to watch for anything. You only need to rest. Sleep well. And thank you for joining us here at the fire with the Desert Hermit.